Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Steve Sherman. I am the Chief of the Forest Protection Bureau, and with me is Captain Reyes. He covers the northern part of the northern half to 2/3 of the state. And he was one of the incident commanders on the Bemis fire. And that brings us to the presentation and really why we put this presentation together. And it was the request of Mark and the selectmen at Hart's location that we put something together to tell municipalities and explain what the laws are when it comes to wildfire suppression, as well as what the liabilities and exposure are for communities when it comes to large wildfires. So we'll discuss all that tonight. I would say we will hold questions to the end, but if you have a question that you don't want to forget or anything, we do have the chat up, so I can see that. If you type a question in the chat, if it's relevant to what's going on, we may be able to offer a quick answer as we go there. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. So make sure this is gonna. Yeah. So what we're really looking at here, we're not really looking at the small fires that you may have, the 1 acre or 2 acre fires, although those can become costly if it's during a dry period of the year and it takes us 3 or 4 days to put out the fire. But what we're really talking about tonight is complex incidents. So these are larger scale events. A lot of the times in New Hampshire, they do involve multiple agencies. Any fire in the state's going to involve the state and the municipality because we work hand in hand on the fire suppression. But we have a lot of federal land, as everybody knows. So oftentimes these large fires bring in that complexity as well. Usually when we talk about operational periods, we're talking about days. So these fires span multiple days, whether it be 3, 4, 5 days. Sometimes they involve evacuations. We've had that happen. A few years ago in the town of Stoddard, we had to have evacuations of residences. And then just the logistical challenges of wildfires being in remote locations. The weather conditions could be drought periods, any number of things that lead to the drought impacts. And also just to discuss some of the lessons learned, just how much better it is for us and the municipality when we work in a unified command with the fire warden and the fire chief, as well as what involvement the town select board or the governing body has during that incident. I will say this program does have a lot of RSAs and things thrown in there, but we'll do our best to make it entertaining and keep it a little lighter. So again, some of what I talked about with the lessons learned, having that liaison or that tie to the governing.
You lost your
body.
volume. Did everybody else lose it as well?
All right. How about now? Is it there?
Mark, can you hear these guys?
I see some thumbs up. So did you just lose us, Michelle?
You're back.
Okay.
For me. I don't know.
Because I was asking you a question. So that worked out well. Thank you, Mark. All right, I'll continue on then. And so then when we get to the unincorporated towns, there's a few things that are a little different there as well. And then we always teach with our fire departments and our fire wardens in each town to really look for arson and responsible parties for when we have fires. And you're going to see why that's important as we go through this. So the first part, we'll talk about where the state authority lies, and then how we do remunerate or pay the towns for expenses incurred, as well as some of the laws and responsibilities of different agencies. So the director of the Division of Forests and Lands, that's the division we're a part of within the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. So we're responsible for the overall prevention and control of woodland or wildland fires throughout the state, except for within the boundaries of the White Mountain National Forest. So the federal government, the U.S. Forest Service, has authority over those areas. As far as remuneration for expenses, right in state statute, it talks about the wardens and deputy wardens of each town and unorganized place are paid for the work that they do. And we set the rates for their hourly rates for what they can be paid, or at least what we'll cost share for the payment. And that includes any of their time when they go to, say, spring trainings that we put on, as well as giving out permits or checking burn areas, and then responding to fires for fire suppression. When we get into the laws governing fire permits, it also talks about anyone who has a fire and doesn't get a permit, or even if they have a permit, if by their negligence the fire is caused, they're liable to the town for civil payment for the suppression costs. Now that can be a little difficult at times, but it is in statute, and we have successfully worked with towns for them to recoup the cost for the suppression. And as I said, it is a civil process by the municipality, and it's either done through the circuit court, or if it's over $10,000, it would go to the Superior Court. And the town does have to bring that forward. So the state, and we'll get into it a little more here, but the state cost shares fire suppression costs with the municipality. So it's a 50-50 cost share. However, when there's a responsible party, the state does not cost share that 50-50, and it's then up to the municipality to use this law to recoup the suppression costs through the civil process. Once it's gone through the courts, the municipality does have the option of placing a lien on property owned in that community, if that's a way to ensure that they do recoup those expenses. Now, criminal penalties are separate from civil action. So there is a criminal penalty for anyone burning without a permit or causing a fire. And that's on us. We take them to court criminally. And if we get a conviction for that, it doesn't always mean that we can ask for restitution right there during that process, during sentencing. Some judges will allow it, but usually they look back at this law and they say, well, there's a civil action that can occur with this law, so we're not going to allow you to put restitution into the sentencing, and the town is then forced to have to go civilly. Where that's a little different is if they're convicted under the arson statute, then that doesn't talk about a civil action that can occur. So sometimes just through that criminal process, communities can get their money back. But with Wildland Fire, we usually stick to this 227L17 for the criminal portion, and then that does mean that if the town wants to get those funds back, they would have to take civil action. Another law that can be used too is 153A24. And that really goes beyond just fire. It says that anyone who creates a situation requiring an emergency response shall be liable for the response expenses. So there's really quite a few statutes in place that support getting those funds back. Now, whether the person can pay them or not, that becomes another story. And, you know, if they do own property in the town, that's where the lien option has been successful in the past. So I talked about the 50-50 cost share, and that's what this statute is talking about. The expenses that are paid out by the town. Well, to back up a little bit, if the fire department and the warden respond to a fire and they incur costs, they submit a fire bill to the town, and the town pays that fire bill, pays all those, the wardens, the deputies, any firefighters, they pay them, and then they submit that bill to the state, to us. And what we do at that point is we'll look it over, and then we'll reimburse the town 50% of those suppression costs. So that's where the 50-50 comes in. So the one exception to this, and we'll talk further about it as well, is once all of the costs for the town reaches 1/4 of 1% of their equalized assessed valuation, at that point, the state takes over and pays 100% of everything, which sounds really good. But here, just to give you some examples, it's still a lot of money. So for example, we'll take Hart's location, their assessed valuation at 23 million. That means 1/4 of 1% is 58,527. So what that means for each community, once you go and you figure this out, is the community has to pay out or incur all of those costs. So 58,527. Once they reach that point, that's when the state will start paying 100% of the remaining costs. So that can be a little confusing, but it's there as a safeguard. But we're still talking about a lot of money. I mean, you look at Lancaster there, Lancaster would be out $996,000 before the state took over 100%. So, you know, we're talking a really large incident. And we've got two examples just to showcase some incidents that we've had. And we actually break this out for the communities that had those fires, so you can see what the impacts look like. Do you have the chat up? Just okay. So again, I already talked about how payments work. So the warden sends the bill to to whoever is in charge in the town, selectmen or mayors, and the treasurer pays out all of the employees on the bills, and then that's sent to the state and we cost share it. So again, just talking about those payments, going further into it. And it's everybody who was on the fire, all the expenses, all the food, all of that is what's put on those bills. So rendering aid to another town, this is specific to, you often hear mutual aid with fire departments. So when one town goes to another town to assist them with a fire, they can bill for their costs. So what ends up happening is within 30 days of rendering that aid, they submit a bill to their ranger. Well, first, their town pays their people, then they give that bill to the ranger, and we put a packet together and give that to the town that had the fire, the town that received all of the aid. That town then has to pay everybody back. And once they do that, they send it to the state and we'll cost share 50% of the entire cost. And again, that's if there isn't a responsible party. If there's a responsible party, then we go back to that civil action to recoup costs. We have a fire bill that the wardens are all familiar with, so they know that they have to put all their costs on that fire bill, submit it, and the town that received the aid pays. And then once it's given to us, back to the state, again, we process the bill and reimburse the community the 50%. Is there a question on there?
No, thank you, Mark, for your comment there. I think we covered it there, talking about mutual aid.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and we'll show that with some of these case studies that we'll show. And when it comes to mutual aid with fire departments, they don't always bill. So sometimes that can be an unknown, but the communities work really well with each other. And especially when they're in their normal mutual aid district, it's quite common that they don't bill each other for these fires. So again, this is talking about the 1/4 of 1%. So the director of forest of the Division of Forests and Lands, when the director has determined that a municipality has reached that point, then that's when the state pays all the bills in the first instance. I will say that anytime we can try to reduce the burden on communities, we do everything we can in our power to do that. So if we can pick up costs in the first instance, even before this 1/4 of 1%, we're working together. That's part of the unified command system is we're working together and deciding where the costs are going to go initially to try to reduce that burden. Again, this is just saying that even when we reach that 1/4 of 1%, the state has an account set up for paying unexpected costs such as these.
All right, so this is where I'll jump in here. So we're hoping basically to kind of put this all in perspective here and cover a case study just to kind of show you guys specifically what we're talking about. You know, when we're talking about a complex incident, and as well as what some of the costs you know, could be. So first off, we'll start talking about Bale Mountain Fire. So here you're seeing just generally where that fire was located in Ossipee. And a picture there of some of the fire activity. So some initial kind of considerations to think about with this fire is this fire started in an area that you know has fuel types that you know that are prone to burning. As a matter of fact, back in 1952, just one ridge line away, there was a fire that reached 1,500 acres. So with this fire, there was potential to threaten structures in the area, as well as the Whittier Mountain State Communication Site, in addition to the vast acres of forest land that were in the area as well. So just to start off here with the Bale Mountain Fire, it was reported in the morning of May 5th. So this was a spring fire in 2015. Initially, as you can see from the photograph, it was, evident that this was going to be a tough one to get to and deal with. The first arriving resources, it took them half an hour, ATV ride just to get out there. The initial report was that this fire was about a football field in size, but growing in steep and rocky terrain. So bringing us to kind of the end of day one with this fire, it ended up having over 70 firefighters on scene just that first day. They ended up having to call in 2 helicopters from JBI, which JBI is a private helicopter contractor here in the state of New Hampshire. Due to the terrain, they were not able to fight this fire overnight, so we had to stick to just daytime operations. But due to the complexity, it was clear that the Seacoast Incident Management Team (IMT) was requested for the next day. So this is just here to give you an idea of kind of what the responding resources we're looking at, when dealing with this fire. So you can see some of the fire activity here from a distance, and in the map that was produced showing how this fire was kind of broken up into two main divisions here, just showing that overall 80 acres here. There was a lot of kind of logistical needs, as you can imagine, with dealing with a large fire like this, and having this many firefighters. So they're fortunate that the Red Cross came in and helped start providing meals for this fire. There was portable toilets that were brought in. There was a portable repeater brought in. Verizon portable cell phone tower. A number of resources, have to be brought in to support the fire suppression needs, with a fire like this, with any of these complex incidents. So now kind of jumping ahead to the end of the second day, now we're up to 107 firefighters on scene. The fire's grown up to 150 acres and is only 80% contained by the end of that second day. And then a third helicopter ended up being requested, as well as some heavy equipment like a skidder and I believe a dozer, were brought in to help get this fire under control. Fire continued to grow though, ended up reaching I think its final size there of 275 acres, when it was 100%, by the time it reached 100% contained. And when I say contained, I just mean the fire was no longer spreading, but certainly not necessarily extinguished. With fires like this, once they get contained, there's still a lot of work to be done. So there was many days of mop up, kind of fully extinguishing this fire planned, or expected from that point forward. But they at least reached, by the end of the third day, reached a point where the helicopters could be released, and were no longer needed for suppression needs. So this is kind of the final map of the fire here. Just showing you that 275 acres there that was burned. So like I was saying, there's once you get this fire contained, there's still a lot of time left for people to get it extinguished and patrol. A lot of times it's hard to call these fires out until you get a significant amount of rainfall, and you can be really confident that there's not some ember still burning in the duff somewhere that could later reignite and get this fire running again. All right, so now I'll kind of jump into some of the estimated costs of this fire. So for starters here, we'll start off with expenses that weren't actually billed for. So there was, quite a bit of food and drink donations over the 5 days of this fire, totaling around, $5,500. There was equipment that was utilized that was not billed for, coming to around $2,500. The porta potty use, the biggest expense that wasn't billed for, though, was mutual aid from surrounding fire departments. And so that accounted for $51,000 of kind of donated expenses or services that were provided that were not billed for. Now to talk about what was billed for, what were the actual costs that were incurred. So out of 47 fire departments that had personnel at this fire, only 10 billed, but that's still close to $5,000. And then, as I'm sure most of you could imagine, the helicopters are what costs the most when we talk about this fire, totaling around $101,000. So that's for 3 helicopters and basically 2 days of use. So total, the cost of actual build costs for this fire was $109,529. But when you consider the things that could have been billed for that weren't, the incident total could have been $169,000. And then just at the bottom of this slide, you'll also see that that 0.25% of the equalized evaluation for OSIP, which is $198,959. So do that in there just to kind of give you an idea of what that was. But this was a big fire. This was a very costly fire. Still, quite a ways away from reaching that 0.25% of the evaluation for the town of OSIP.
Just to go back to this for 1 second, that 0.25%, so that was OSP's valuation back then. So that's gone up since then, as with valuations. So that would be even higher now. And when you look at that incident total of 169,282, so that wasn't or the total cost billed. So we'll go back to the 109,000. That wasn't what the town of OSPI ended up paying in total, because we have that 50-50 cost share. So they wouldn't have, they still had a long ways to go before they reached that 198,000. So just to put that in perspective, it's not the total cost of the fire, it's the town's portion of the fire that needs to hit that 0.25% before the state takes it over. So now we'll talk a little bit about fires on federal lands in the northern part of the states with the U.S. Forest Service lands. This comes into play. We'll also talk about fires in the unorganized places or the unincorporated towns, and some other aspects to fire in New Hampshire and regionally as far as resources available to us. So fires on federal land, we already have agreements in place, the state and the U.S. Forest Service. We have agreements in place for sharing resources, how we pay for fires. So a lot of this is taken care of behind the scenes, so that when we do have a fire that is either on the national forest or even a boundary line fire, like the Bemis fire in Hart's location, we already have a system in place so that we're not trying to figure it out as the fire is spreading. We already know that we're going to work in unified command, And we talk about costs right up front, very early, who's gonna pay for what. But if you have a fire that is 100% on federal land, then how it works for the town is the town pays their firefighters. They're gonna submit the bill to the state, just like they would for any other fire. And the only difference at this point would be that the state reimburses the town 100%. Because our mission is to always reduce the expenditures of the town and how long the town might be out of funds. So when we are in this situation, the state picks it up, pays the town 100% back, and then we work with the Forest Service to recoup that money, which sometimes can take a little bit. You know, we're not the only state in the country, and there's a lot of fires, so they have a lot of reimbursements to look at. So while that's taking place, that's on the state, and we work with them and we recoup that money. So that's really all I'm gonna get into on the Forest Service, because it's just important to note that you know, the town's gonna pay their folks, they're gonna send it to the state, state's gonna reimburse them 100%. So that's really the take-home message there, and how that works with fires on the national forest. If you have further questions about that, only because I know there's a lot of folks in the meeting who are on the boundary or have national forests in their towns, we can address those as we go. Unorganized places, so just like any other town, they do have a forest fire warden, they have deputy wardens. The only difference here, or one of the differences, is when they have bills or they have expenses, they're submitting those directly to our agency, and the state pays those 100% upfront. So it's not going to the county, it's not going to that unincorporated place, which really it would end up going to the county at that point. So the county doesn't have to put that money up or anything. The state pays that. And, you know, as a side note, we do get funds from the unincorporated towns each year. So this is all part of those services that are provided when there's anything that the wardens or deputy wardens are doing in those towns, the state's picking up those costs. This just talks again, really similar to any other municipality. Again, if somebody causes a fire in an unincorporated town, then they're liable for those costs of suppression. The one big difference here is that the state is responsible for that civil action, not the municipality or the unincorporated place. So really the state stepping in per these statutes and acting as that quasi governing board there. So the state would pay the firefighters, and then the state would go to try to recoup the cost for the civil action. On the bottom here, one little difference too. If a fire is caused from unknown or natural causes, say a lightning strike, or we don't know who the person is that left the campfire or something, up to half of the costs, but in no case to exceed 10% of the assessed valuation of the unincorporated place. That can be put back by the state, half of the expenses onto the tax burden for that unincorporated place. We haven't done that. We've had fires that have been started by unknown causes, or we didn't know who, and the state has continued to pay for those. But if we had a large incident, that statute is there, and that could change. But that's how we've done it in the past. So one thing that we do have at our disposal, when we talk about agreements and memberships, as part of state law, we are part of, the Northeast, Interstate Forest Fire Protection Compact. And just think of that, you have your local towns with mutual aid. Well, this is mutual aid on a regional level. So if we ever need assistance, beyond what our capabilities are here in New Hampshire for, maybe we have a lot of incidents or incidents that require some technical skills that we don't have locally, we could call other states, we can call different provinces up north, up in Canada, and they'll send us resources to help us out. Up in Quebec, they have water bombers, airplanes, we can call them and they can come fly down from Quebec, fly, dump water on the fire, scoop water out of our lakes, dump more water on the fire, and then they can return to Quebec. So we do have different options for us. But this just allows that sharing of resources. But furthermore, it does talk about reimbursement. So any of the costs for transportation, wages, salaries, all of that can be invoiced to the state. And what happens here is, say we have that aircraft come down from Quebec, they help us with the fire, they're gonna give us an invoice for what that cost. The state's gonna pay that upfront and take care of that, so Quebec's all paid for. And then what's gonna happen is, the state is going to enact that 50-50 cost share with the municipality. So the state's then gonna invoice the municipality for 50% of those costs. So that's how that works when we do bring in resources from other areas. Again, to kind of go back to one of those first slides, this is why we work in unified command. The state's gonna be there for these fires. We're gonna be working with the warden, with the fire chief, and we'll be making decisions on what do we need to do to put this fire out, what's tactically sound, and what's feasible economically too. And you know, there's challenges there, and we're always weighing that. We may call in a helicopter, but the minute we don't need that helicopter anymore, we're gonna release that helicopter, so we're reducing any further costs. So that's the system we've used in New Hampshire. It does work very well, and it's a good system to make sure that all those local considerations are factored in as well. So again, just talking about that payment. So once the state invoices a municipality for those costs, then they have 60 days to pay to reimburse the state. I will say, when we had the Bemis fire in Crawford Notch, we did have resources come in from the state of Maine. And for that fire, we had a responsible party. And we worked with Hart's Location to, make sure that we worked with that responsible party as quickly as possible, both us and Hart's Location, so that we could recoup the cost for everybody. And the resources we brought in from the state of Maine, the state paid for those, and then we submitted the bill directly to the responsible party. We didn't make Hart's Location pay 50% and then try to chase it down. So, anytime we can reduce that burden, we do everything we can to do that. Railroad fires, just wanted to throw this in there. This statute makes it very clear, and has worked for us in the past, that without considering any admission of guilt or wrongdoing, if a fire is caused by the railroad, then the railroad has to pay for it. So that's just how the state law reads. It's very matter of fact, and we've used that in the past very successfully. So what happens when your community has emergency expenditures that put you over budget? So every municipality are appropriated funds. So if you get into a situation where there's an emergency, the state has a process through the commissioner of the Department of Revenue, or DRA. So I won't get too far into this because this is really getting out of my wheelhouse, but I just want to make sure that you all know some of the tools, and this isn't even specific to fire. This is just an emergency expenditure and over expenditure that allows your municipality to put an application into the Department of Revenue Administration. And at that point, it's in their hands how they can help the community out as far as that goes. And they do have some stuff on their website that talks about this. But if you ever get into that situation, this is where you'll have your town council and be working with DRA for guidance, especially if it's or for anything. But just keep that in mind. If you have a wildfire that pushes you into that, then this could come into play for that as well. And one other thing we have is through FEMA, this is a fire management assistance grant. We call them an FMAG. And what this does is when we reach certain criteria during a wildfire, we can request an FMAG declaration. And this is going to help in the end to pay some of the costs for the fire if it's approved. And I say if, we have done this in New Hampshire at least once in the past that I know of. We submitted for an FMAG and it was denied. So it's never any 100% guarantee of this. So the individual incident for New Hampshire would have to have a cost of $126,000 or more. And then we do have a cumulative threshold within the state. So if we had multiple fires going and we hit 500,000, we could apply for the FMAG. One thing with these FMAG declarations is they have to be made while the fire is still active. And a big part of it is the fire has to be threatening destruction of basically approved areas. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. The town would not declare the FMAG. This is done at the state level. So we would be working with the governor's office as well as the state Homeland Security and Emergency Management and working directly with FEMA on that. So the criteria that has to be met, we have to have a threat to lives and improved property. And that includes critical infrastructure. So when you're all looking at your hazard mitigation plans, be thinking about all that. And that's why it's important to have that stuff identified. But watersheds are also in there. The second part is we have to talk about the availability of state and local firefighting resources. So have we tapped out resources, or are we bringing in so many? You know, when we have these fires, we're bringing in resources from across the state. Even the local fire departments are sending people from all over the state to help out. We do have to be in high fire danger, so we can't do this if the fire occurs on a moderate fire danger day. And then there has to be potential for major economic impact. So this is the criteria that's being looked at for us just to do that initial declaration or that initial application for the FMAG.
All right, so I'll take us through another quick case study here. Again, just to give you guys an idea of, you know, some fires from the not too distant past and what their expenses were for the municipality. So we'll talk here about the Dilly Fire which was in Woodstock in October of 2017. So, this was a lot like, the previous case study we talked about. Fires reported 6 in the morning, and reported to be less than 1 acre in size, but again, located in some pretty steep terrain, located in the area of Dilly Cliff. So this is right near the tourist attraction of Lost River Gorge on Route 112 in Woodstock. So as a matter of fact, the parking lot for the Lost River Gorge was what was used for the incident command post and the staging area for all the resources. So with day one here, basically it started off with Woodstock Fire Department personnel, hiking in and trying to see if they could get this extinguished. But it was pretty quickly determined that this is going to be a multi-day event. So again, like we were talking about at the start of this presentation, a complex incident. So here's some additional photographs from that day one. It's very clear the fire was growing. It grew to be about 25 acres in that first day. Oops. So here's a quick video of kind of what that fire looked like on day one. What resources we're seeing from the ground. And you can see here we have JBI coming in to do a bucket drop. So, JBI's buckets hold about 150 gallons of water. But you can see with how steep and rugged this terrain is, that's one of the major factors that we're looking at when we're considering helicopters like that. So again, we'll talk about some of the local support, which was great. There was many donations of food and drinks. A huge help with this fire was the Grafton County Sheriff's communication trailer. That was one we used at the Bemis fire as well. There was an ambulance, that was staged there that at no cost. Many of the Lost River Gorge facilities were utilized, and there's a lot of support from the local fire departments. So one thing very unusual about this fire, but not unheard of, is how active it was overnight. So this, as you can see, this is a video of that first night of the fire. Typically we see fires die down at night. Relative humidities come up, the temperatures go down. Usually that results in a much less active fire, but that wasn't the case in this instance. And we don't see that type of fire behavior a lot, but we like to show that video because it shows just what fires here in New Hampshire can do, even though it's not it might not be what you see on the news out west, but we can have some pretty extreme fire behavior at times. So coming into day two, it was realized that some larger helicopters were needed. So a Black Hawk from the National Guard was requested. So those buckets hold 600 gallons, so significantly more than the 100 or 150 that JBI helicopters can bring. So the fire grew, continued to grow, as you saw, overnight and into day two. So it reached 50 acres. You just saw that video of that extreme fire behavior. And because it continued to grow, they actually ordered up a second Black Hawk helicopter from the National Guard. And in addition to that, a incident management team, the Seacoast Incident Management Team, was requested, along with some overhead from our division, and a Type 3 incident commander was requested. Due to the growing complexity of this fire, the number of resources that had to be brought in, the number of helicopters that were being utilized, all kind of add to the complexity. So now coming into day 3, fire is up to 75 acres in size. You know, very busy airspace with 3 helicopters up there. And there was you know, a unique, there was an issue that we see more and more nowadays, and where people started coming in with drones and wanting to see this fire. One of the huge one of the many, I guess, kind of negative aspects of this fire is that on day 3 they actually had to ask, you know, Lost River Gorge to close, which was very unfortunate because this was over a holiday weekend, which happened to be their busiest, their typical busiest day of the year. So getting back to those drone incursions that I was talking about, they had to request a temporary flight restriction be implemented, and that's actually something that nowadays, anytime we're using helicopters, or you know, sometimes we're using drones in the actual suppression efforts for the fire. So we pretty typically just go ahead and request those temporary flight restrictions in the area anytime we're using any kind of aircraft. You know, on day 3, there was this delegation of authority signed, you know, kind of giving authority to the incident commander, the Type 3 incident commander, to kind of take charge and help manage this fire. But by day 3, we did start to see the fire behavior lessen quite a bit and become a lot less extreme. And there was some good progress made. You know, there was a number of spot fires, you know, and what I mean by spot fire is sometimes embers from the main fire kind of jump ahead and start fires ahead or outside of the main fire. So that's what I'm referring to. So there was a number of those, but those kind of by the end of the 3rd day, they were starting to get kind of get everything contained. Coming into day 4, they started releasing helicopters, and you know, the transition was made back, was made to that IMT and that Type 3 commander. Yeah, that was initially requested. So they did, you know, as always, retain some state and local leadership personnel, some people that, you know, had an idea of what the fire had been doing for those previous days, and familiarity with all the resources on scene. Day 5 is where really a lot of the progress was made with suppression efforts. You know, the air support was reduced just to the 1 JBI helicopter. And then looking at the forecast, there was some expected wet weather coming in, so they started kind of dialing back on how many resources were being utilized. As with the other case study we talked about, you know, there's the main suppression efforts that happen in the, you know, the first, you know, few days to a week, and then following that, there's a lot of follow-up that's done in the coming weeks. You know, I don't think this fire was considered out until you know, there was almost snow on the ground that year. So you know, there was many flare-ups over the following days and weeks that passerbys would call in, and at times, you know, fire personnel would be redispatched to go take a look at it and try and put out those hot spots that had developed. All right, so we'll get into the kind of the expenses a little bit of this fire as well. So first off, talking about that JBI Bell 206, that's considered a Type 3 helicopter. At the time, that helicopter cost about $1,900 an hour, and it has since gone up quite a bit. So the total cost for that JBI helicopter was over $63,000. And now, with the National Guard helicopter, that cost at the time was around $5,500 an hour. And so if the National Guard had billed, which they did not, it would have been $264,000. So some pretty big expenses there with the aviation. Some additional costs from this fire was around for state and local costs was around 80,000. Federal costs, so you know, firefighters, national forests, out of the national forest and stuff, and their equipment, $85,000. And then the in-kind services, so those services that you know, mostly ended up not being billed for, totaled to around $330,000, sorry. So a grand total here of $495,000 here for this fire. So you know, and again, you know, very fortunate that many services were not billed for. You know, obviously that huge expense of the Blackhawks. The National Guard did not bill for that, so that was great. But you can see just how expensive some of these complex fires can get very quickly. Yeah, but again, just to talk a little bit about that threshold for the 0.25%, at the time for the town of Woodstock would have been $723,676. So you know, despite you know, how expensive this fire was, still pretty far away from that threshold. But hopefully these, you know, I do hope that these case studies kind of gives everyone a good idea of the potential costs of a major, you know, complex wildfire.
So one thing with those pictures, we just, there was a local photographer, Karen Coles, out of Bath, who took a lot of those pictures, and she provided them to our agency so we could use them for trainings like this. So we just like to give her a shout out on that. So just to wrap up here, really looking at lessons learned from both the state as well as the local side. Again, we always try to have that unified command in place so that we're all making decisions together regarding firefighting resources and costs. Having a liaison from the Board of Selectmen or with the town manager or mayor, it's a good idea. We're not saying every municipality needs to have somebody embedded at the fire at all times, but we need to have that communication. A lot of times that can occur, whether it's between the forest fire warden or the fire chief and the select board. Sometimes that works well, but it's good to just identify that. And you as or municipalities, their selectmen, their town manager, or the mayor should always know that, you know, if they have an incident like this, they should reach out to their fire chief or their fire warden, and, you know, they can be updated and informed of what's going on. And I'm sure there's some folks here who can talk about the benefits of that as you're trying to plan and handle an incident. The unincorporated towns, really that would be where the warden and the ranger, we would liaison with the county commissioners. That's the body that we would communicate with, just to give them a heads up on fires that are reaching this complexity level. And on the flip side, if we're busy and miss that, then the commissioners know who we are and they can reach out to us. And again, with the suspected arson fires, it's always, again, with these costs that you can see, if there's somebody who's liable for the fire, then we want to take steps to charge that person and to recoup what costs we can, whether it's on the state, municipal, or federal side. And, that's not always possible, as I said before, when you're talking about a fire, that might be $500,000. Even if you have a responsible party, that doesn't always mean you're gonna receive payment for it, but trying to find out who's responsible is always important. And with that, just like to say thank you to everybody. And we do have time to open it up to some questions, so we can certainly do that. I threw up our X account and our Instagram account. We do put out the daily fire danger on those. So if you do follow us on those, you can get the daily fire danger every day. Which today was low because we have a lot of snow, so that's good.
Yes. Great. Well, thank you. That's definitely a lot of information for municipal leaders to digest and dive into. I open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat or just raise your hand and we can call on you. Mark?
Yeah, thanks for that presentation and overview. And I would just like to speak from the vantage point of a municipal leader who had to respond to the Bemis fire in Hart's location, and a couple of things that you maybe didn't cover that might be useful information to the participants here tonight. One of them was the choice to call in a helicopter, and you didn't do a case study of the Bemis fire for us. So in that incident, the fire was growing rapidly. There was a threat to personnel on site. There was a threat to resources, and Unified Command called me and recommended that we authorize air support for the fire. And the justifications that they gave were largely a no-brainer. Well, of course, I'm going to authorize air support to protect human life and to protect damage to the resource. So on one level, it was one of the easiest decisions I'd ever made. But then, the fiscally responsible side of me sort of kicked in for a moment. It's just like, well, wait a minute, what is this going to cost us? And there I was assured that the source of the fire was known and identified, and that those costs would be reimbursed to the town, and that it was more important to take action immediately and get the support that was required. In an after incident meeting at the Barwood Fire Station, we had some further discussion about this, and one of the comments that was made was, well, you could have just gone to our website to look at what the cost for the helicopter support was. And I have to say that in the heat of the moment, literally, that wasn't a practical alternative. But in the case of the Bemis fire, the helicopter support was $24,000 out of the total $39,000 in cost that the town had to bear. And so I was just wondering if you could describe for the other participants here in the meeting tonight how that decision is reached, what Unified Command actually looks like, and sort of the role of the town liaison in authorizing that expense and action.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And as we've said, and you could see with these case studies, anytime we bring in aircraft, that just raises the cost quite a bit. We don't take that lightly. We are looking at the safety of the firefighters, safety of the community, what the fire behavior is doing, where it's burning, as well as what it's threatening. So we take a lot of components into that. And our process for ordering the helicopter is that the ranger on scene is talking with the local fire chief or the fire warden. And they're talking about, okay, these are our tactics, this is what we're dealing with. We need to have a helicopter here. We are checking all these boxes for safety concerns with fire behavior. So then the ranger's next call is either to the captain or to myself. So we don't order a helicopter until we run it up through our chain of command. And then usually what ends up happening is I'm making the call to either the private contractor JBI or to Homeland Security to get in touch with the National Guard or the state of Maine or Quebec. We use our Northeast Interagency Coordination Center to make those contacts, and we would order the helicopter that way. So there's a lot of decision making that goes into that. Really, by the time that the selectmen are being called, and some towns, their fire chief or their fire warden makes that call, and they choose, they're allowed to make that decision to authorize the helicopter. Some towns, they want that person to call the select board. And, you know, I know there's financial impacts and fiscal responsibility, but I can assure folks that we're not ever requesting the helicopter just for the fun of it. So to deny a helicopter, it does have big impacts. And usually those impacts are to, at the very minimum, firefighter safety. So, you know, it's a big decision, and we don't take it lightly. And we don't use helicopters a ton here in New Hampshire. Where we usually get into it the most is in really steep, impossible terrain, like you saw in the Dilly fire, or when we have a fire that's just really burning, extreme fire behavior. The Stoddard fire a few years ago, that was 200 acres. That ended up with 15 houses being evacuated. We had, I think, 3 or 4 helicopters on that. But we had a fire that was running, and there was no way anybody was going to catch that fire or put it in check without having air resources. So that's where that becomes really important. So it's a great point and a great perspective, Mark, on your side, that it does cost a lot to have those air resources. And like you said, the easiest decision to make, but a lot of impact to that decision.
Thanks for clarifying that. I should open up the forum to other questions, but I probably have a couple other points to share.
It's quiet. Other questions? Go ahead.
Okay, so in the case of the Bemis fire, fortunately, there was ultimately a determined source, but for a period of maybe a few weeks, the source was officially undetermined until a full-scale investigation could take place. And during that period of time, the town was needing to pay the bills that we had received, including the helicopter bills. And at that point, you know, we were looking at a possible or probable cost share scenario. Once the source of the fire was determined, then the table shifted a little bit, and the town was responsible for paying 100% of the costs of the fire suppression before becoming eligible for reimbursement. And I have to say, in our tiny town of Harts location with a municipal budget of only around $50,000, the $39,000 cost that we had to shell out to pay for all the fire suppression costs pretty much wiped us out financially and left us with zero cash flow to manage our other expenses and liabilities. You mentioned earlier getting emergency authorization from the Department of Revenue for unbudgeted expenses. Well, nobody told me about that. And I've been a selectman for over 20 years. And so I was sort of winging that. And, we had the cash flow to pay the bills, but we left ourselves nearly penniless in the process. So I think it was really good that you brought up the point about reaching out to Department of Revenue for emergency authorization and expenditure. But one of the things that you told me repeatedly in the meetings we had near the time of the fire was that although if a source of the fire is determined, then that source is responsible for reimbursement to the town. We were fortunate that the source of the fire had the means to reimburse us. And what happens in instances when the source of the fire doesn't have those means to reimburse the town? At that point, the town has shelled out 100% of the cost to suppress the fire. It's not a cost share fire with the state because the source has been determined. Does the town get left holding the entire bill? I think towns need to know that if that's the case.
And that can be the case. If it's a large bill, then the town we can work with the town, and the director of the Division of Forests and Lands does have the authority to go into the 50-50 cost share with the town if the town has exhausted all the means possible to recoup the funds from the responsible party. So as you use in this example, if the responsible party was somebody who couldn't pay that, and the town did go through the court process and the money just wasn't there, then the town can reach back out to the state, and the director can look over the entire situation and determine once the town has gone through and exhausted all means possible to get the funds, that we could go into that cost share side of it. So as you can imagine with what I just said, that's a lengthy process. That's not something that is going to be, well, hey, we know this person's not going to be able to pay, let's cost share. We have to show that the town has gone through the process, through the court process to recoup those funds, and it's just not going to happen. So that can happen down the road, but that's probably not going to help you in that first fiscal year as you're dealing with the issue.
Great, thank you. So as a follow-up to this, and I think your case studies revealed that the possible financial exposure to towns in dealing with these complex fire incidents can be quite great. And so awareness is maybe part of the battle, but perhaps more importantly is how do you recommend that towns prepare financially for this potential exposure? You showed the 0.25% valuation, equalized valuation, and I would just have to say, that amount would have exceeded our annual budget. And I imagine that that's true for most of the communities who are participating in this forum this evening. So that's huge exposure. How does the state recommend that towns prepare for this eventuality? Because wildfires are going to happen. They're going to happen in one of our communities, and one of our towns or multiple towns are going to be left foot in the bill and possibly holding the bag if the determined source is unable to pay for reimbursement. So what's a town supposed to do to be prepared?
So For that question, I would actually expand it beyond just wildfire. And, you know, we talk about all hazard events in our line of work. As we all know, we experience, or communities experience, all sorts of disasters now. Some on a more frequent basis, such as flooding from large rain events. So I am definitely not a budget person for my community. As active as I am, I'm not the budget person, but I would think, and maybe Michelle has some thoughts on this too, that the Department of Revenue Administration would be the one to be able to assist communities with how they can have a budget that is going to be able to maybe not withstand, but better absorb impacts from some of these unplanned, unexpected emergency events that occur.
Yeah, I
Just
think
as a-
you're, oh, go ahead, Mark, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as a follow-up, Hearts Location's response was to establish an emergency response cash reserve fund with the state, and we put $10,000 in it last year and another $10,000 in it this year. But at that rate of $10,000 a year, which will still have some impact on the tax rate, it's going to take us 6 years to accumulate an amount that would cover the threshold of 0.25% of valuation, so that we would not have exposure to those costs. So, and for larger towns with bigger budgets and more assessed valuation, that's going to take a lot more money to put aside.
Yeah,
think-
no, that's Michelle, I don't know if you had anything further on that.
No, I was just gonna say that I think you're gonna see a lot of communities start working towards you know, putting that cash reserve into a an event category, whether it's high rain, floods, washouts, fires. I think that is really what we're potentially looking at in a lot of cases, because these events are happening more often, whether depending on what it is. And there is valid point to Mark that the percentage of that evaluation is, for some communities, is quite high, and it will take a long time to cover even a portion of what is owed. I don't see any other questions in the chat. This recording will be posted on our website. The slide deck will be posted on our website. So by Friday, we hope to have it up and available to you. If you have questions, follow-up questions, or if we touched upon something this evening that you want to learn more about, I would reach out to us, reach out to me, and we can see what a follow-up presentation to this might look like, whether it's a deeper dive into the RSAs. I know that I've had conversations with New Hampshire Municipal Association about maybe taking a look at this from not only the wildfire perspective, but also a little bit deeper into the RSAs that govern some of this stuff, but also the DRA portion of it too, and just learning more about that at the municipal level. Any other questions before we close for the evening? Great. Well, thank you very much for presenting this evening. This is just a incredibly important topic, and I'm just glad to start the conversation.
Yes, and thank you for reaching out, and thank you everybody for taking the time for the program. So really appreciate it and glad to get the info out there.